This is an interesting feature to have at an archaeological fundraiser because actually we have very little actually we have no archaeological evidence for this for the Locust Grove Distillery. The only piece of information that we had about it was a purchase record from the Fitzhugh & store in 1808 when William Cron, who owned the property, was part of a still purchase, a 66-gallon still. With him in that purchase was his brother-in-law, Owen Gwathmey. We really don't know how he figured into the whole thing, but it really was not a surprise when we discovered that William Cron had bought a still, just because we also knew that he had a mill and he had orchards. And a small farm distillery like this was part of crop processing. And so that's why we really wanted to do the distillery at Locust Grove, is so we could start to draw people more into this story of the farm and of crop processing. And so we didn't do it just because it's really cool to have a distillery, but because it's part of this small farm economy. And it's a way to actually, I mean, people get excited about it still. So this is a very good way to talk about this small farm economy. Now, like I said, the operation here was a small farm distillery. This is not an industrial operation like George Washington's Mount Vernon. And I got to give credit to those guys too. I mean, they really, the training that they gave us is really what that was the cornerstone of the knowledge that we had to build on out here as far as how to get all this done. So if you were to go to Mount Vernon, to George Washington's distillery, it was a money-making operation. He has 5 stills in graduating size. Yeah, I think the smallest one is this size. Okay, we got a 70-gallon here, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. This, like I say, is crop processing. It's to make the most use of your crops in the era before refrigeration. So you have your grain crops, you have your fruit crops, and those crops, if you're producing a certain yield, they're going to spoil before they can be consumed if you don't ferment them and distill them into spirits. And so it's a tradable, preserved way that you can actually still get some sort of revenue, some sort of return off of those crops. Now, eventually we're going to start talking about brandy. Mostly we're talking about whiskey here. Like I said, William Cron had a mill, and everybody didn't have a mill, so other people had to come to your mill to mill their grain, and sometimes you were paid in grain from that, and so chances are a mill owner will have a surplus grain crop, and so you have to have a way to preserve that crop. And so, with all the controversy, all the laws, all the permits, all the regulations, the this and that, there's whiskey, folks. Yeah. Okay? Corn and rye. And here's some rye grain right here if you want to feel it. We're going to be putting rye in here soon. I always say really the only difference between whiskey, beer, and bread is the way it's cooked. It's all fermented grain. It's cooked in a certain way. And so that's what we're dealing with here. Kentucky did have a lot of corn grown during these times. Like I said, we're starting like in 1808, going maybe to 1822. Rye was also a really popular component of Kentucky whiskey back in those days. And so if we were down here, and full disclaimer, this was probably more substantial than the Crons actually had. It was probably located near the mill. It might not have been this substantial of an operation, but basically we have security concerns these days, and so we kind of made it so hopefully it would stay. So if we were to be, if it was 1808 and we were going to do a batch of whiskey off of our surplus crop, the first thing we do is we boil water over here. People keep calling this a mash cooker. It's not. It's a boiler. This will be filled with water. This holds over 50 gallons of water, which is good for our still, and we just boil that water. And as you can see, I've been cooking it here for a little while, but it's not up to boiling yet. There's a lot of passive time when it comes to distilling. So once that water boils, the mash is actually cooked in a barrel. Okay, and this one is actually just a standard bourbon barrel, but it happens to be the perfect size for a single batch to go into this still. Our still's 70 gallons, but we really should only be putting maybe just over 50 gallons into that. You only want to get up to the well line in there. So we're looking at putting about 50 gallons of mash into the still at a time. So the way that goes is it's real simple. It's basically a bucket brigade. You've got somebody with the grain. You've got somebody with, say these to our stirring mechanisms, a mash rake and a mash paddle. You got somebody on these, and then hopefully you've got a couple of people running buckets of water over to the barrel. So we've got a few different ingredients that goes into this. The first is corn. All right, and that's probably going to comprise the majority of the grain that goes into our whiskey, this early Kentucky whiskey. We're not talking about bourbon, okay? This is kind of the granddaddy of bourbon, but it's not bourbon yet. Corn is the first thing to go in with the boiling water because that cooks at the hottest temperature. All right, so you get all your corn in. We're looking maybe in excess of 50 pounds to go into a barrel like this. We get that in with our boiling water and we cook that corn first. Our second grain is going to be just rye. Now this, I've got rye seed here if you just want to see what it looks like. All of this would have been milled into a very coarse meal when you're putting it into the whiskey. And rye cooks a little bit cooler than corn does. And so a good rule of thumb is wait about 20-25 minutes between putting the corn in and introducing the rye into your mash. And so you'll introduce that grain and you will continue to mix. You want to keep this mixing. All right. The next thing is really crucial. You got to wait for that temperature to get down just below 150 degrees for the next ingredient. And this is also partly why we want to start to do our fermenting and distilling maybe a little bit cooler than the weather we have now. We're not going to do this in the full heat of summer because if it takes too long for the temperature of that mash to come down, then we're going to start to see spoilage before we can get our fermentation going, right? So the next ingredient is malt. All right, now I'm not a science guy, I'm really not, but